This is Project Management Paradise. This episode of the Project Management Paradise podcast is part of a unique limited series called Unlocking Project Success with Professor John McGrath.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Project Management Paradise podcast, your passport to project success. I'm John McGrath, your host, and our guest for this episode is Lauren Ayers. Lauren's most recent role has been Director of Program Analysis and Business Transformation for the Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Navy. Procurement responsible for providing strategic advice and direction to over 300 billion of procurement across the FYDP. Lauren, you have an absolutely amazing career history. You spent 15 years with the Navy, 2 years with the Pentagon. I'm really not doing it justice. If you would, give us a couple of your highlights, maybe from graduating from university, or even where did you go to university with such a strong military background?
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to hit the wave tops here. So I went to a university here in Virginia called James Madison University. My degree is in finance and economics. And right after university, I started with the Navy. So spent about 3 or 4 years as a contract specialist, which essentially were responsible for negotiating and awarding and executing contracts. So I spent about 3 or 4 years with the Navy right out of college. But with my degree in finance and economics, I actually wanted to work in the capital markets. So I took about a 4-year stint and worked in private wealth management. So being able to pull the capital markets experience into my knowledge from working for the Navy right out of college, I decided I actually wanted to go back and support the warfighter. So in 2010, I rejoined the Navy at the Naval Sea Systems Command. And the programs I was working at NAVSEA are what's called Major Defense Acquisition Programs, or MDAP programs. So I was responsible for shipbuilding programs. So most people have probably seen carriers. I didn't buy carriers, but I sat next to the gentleman who did buy carriers. I bought destroyers, so the DDG-1000, DDG-51, and LCS programs. So I spent about 10 years doing that at the Naval Sea Systems Command. And then I decided that I wanted to get a master's degree, and the Navy sponsored me to go to one of our war colleges, National Defense University, the Eisenhower School. So I actually have a master's degree in national security and resource strategy. So that was really looking top down. How do we do the business of the government? How do we actually do acquisition in a way that's meaningful? So after I had that under my belt, I actually decided that I wanted to work for the Pentagon. So I spent 2 years at, as you mentioned, DASN procurement. And that was, so DASN is specific to the Navy again, so staying within the Navy environment, but was responsible for every procurement that was, the FYDP is the fit up. So that's the Future Defense Years program. So it covers, I think, 5 or 7 years of requirements. So if you wanted to buy something in a 5 or 7 year window, it was going to come across my desk, and we provided strategic advice on the best way to actually go about procuring, whether it was a service or a ship, an airplane, whatever you wanted to buy for the Navy. We were kind of that central point to evaluate and provide strategic advice on the best way to do that. Okay,
so purely from the level of spend and budget, it's in my world, in the project management, hardcore project management world, I would say you're working exclusively in mega projects. We define a mega project as something costing $1 billion, impacting 1 million people or more. Give us some idea of the level of spend, Lauren. What kind of big bucks are we talking about?
Well, so my portfolio specifically when I was at the Navy was about $40 billion. So that was spread across 6 or 8 unique contracts. And that was from what we would call soup to nuts. So from buying the ship, stepping back, from designing the ship, changes, upgrades, whatever needed to be done to keep that asset modern. So we were doing the design engineering for that, constantly preparing for the next competition to buy more ships to make sure that we had enough in the fleet, as well as engineering and support services to maintain those ships while they're floating around and supporting our sailors, as well as end of life. So actually doing the disposition and the disposal of those assets. So me personally, as one contracting officer among thousands at the Navy, had a $40 billion portfolio. And that was managed, I would co-manage that with a Navy program manager. Most often they're in uniform. So I worked very closely with a Navy captain who's an 06. That's the equivalent to a colonel in the other services. The Navy still follows a little bit of the British Navy ranking. So we're a little unique in that. So
okay, so just to put that in perspective, you're managing 40 billion in program effort, I suppose, but the Irish government is spending about 14 billion or maybe slightly less on our capital infrastructure. So how do you sleep at night? How do you manage that level of stress? 40 billion.
That's a great question, and it comes down to it's a team environment. So as a contracting officer, my signature meant that the government was obligated to pay the money, right? So $40 billion to our contractors. So my signature, I was personally obligating the US government that we agree to the price, the goods and services are what we need, and we agree to the delivery schedule. But I worked very closely with the Navy captain and his whole team. So we probably had a program management staff of over 100 folks doing quality control, looking at cost data, looking at all the deliverables. Me and my team were looking at what do we need to negotiate next? How do we prepare and succeed in executing the contract that's in front of us, as well as looking forward to what do we need, what do we need in 5 years kind of thing. So it takes a village to manage these types of projects. And that's just who was in my office at NAVC. We also had folks at each of the shipyards. So we had teams roughly the same size at each of the build yards that were walking the ships every day, talking to the contractors, figuring out are they on track for cost, schedule, performance, and they would feed that information back to us in case there needed to be some sort of discussion about the requirements.
Okay, and it's interesting. You look at it from the people side, which I obviously wouldn't have the exposure to that you would have. But when I look at it here, 3,000 miles or more away, what does strike me is the rigor that you have set up in terms of GovCon, in terms of Defence Contracting Management Agency, in terms of the rigor and the processes they have, which are extremely onerous, and they have to be, because at the end of the day, it's taxpayers' dollars and its national security is at stake here. But in terms of DCMA and GovCon, for the purpose of our listeners, could you give a helicopter overview of explaining it? And please do use those military terms like hitting the waves, etc. We're really loving them here.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think I could pull those out of my lexicon if I tried after almost 20 years of being supporting the military.
I love them. Keep going. Yeah.
So DCMA is the Defense Contract Management Agency, and they have a huge job. So again, my $40 billion was just one program for the Navy, but DCMA is responsible for administering all of the contracts, the entire DoD awards, which I think I just looked up some statistics. It's over 300,000 contracts in 15 countries, valued at over $7 trillion. So my 40 billion is a drop in the bucket to what DCMA overall is responsible for administering. And they're essentially calling a back office function is a little bit of a misnomer, but my team, we were responsible for awarding the contract, developing the requirements, negotiating the effort, and then DCMA picks up the baton at that point, and they actually have some people that are embedded. In fact, most of the time at the major weapon systems programs, they have folks that are embedded with the contractor. So they'll have somebody sitting on site at Raytheon that is managing and evaluating how closely Raytheon, for example, is following the requirement, is following the cost, schedule, and performance. So DCMA does that. They also do the invoice processing. So if you can imagine $7 trillion, and our contractors can bill every 2 weeks. So it is a huge administrative burden to process and make sure that people are paid on time, because if we don't pay them on time, then there's actually cost penalties. So DCMA performs just a vital function that I couldn't do my job without everything that they're doing, managing the invoicing, the actual performance, and they also do a lot of data analysis. So EVMS is one of the legacy tools that is phenomenal, but it's really built for these, as you would call them, mega projects. I think they just upped the limit, just 2015 seems like yesterday, to $100 million. So if you have an MDOC program over $100 million, you have to do an EVMS program, and DCMA is critical for evaluating that data, processing it, and helping us make real-time decisions based on that.
Yeah, okay, that's interesting. So what's clear is the complexity of it, and there's very established roles and responsibilities for different agencies throughout the project lifecycle. But nonetheless, the complexity of negotiating, engaging, and communicating with stakeholders, how do you even begin that process on something so large?
Well, I mean, that's the part of it that I loved. So part of the reason why I kind of took a different career path was I got away from the negotiating table. But a lot of it comes down to relationships. So these ships and these major programs, we've been embedded with these contractors for decades at some point, and we have developed relationships with them to understand, where are they in their environment? How is our requirement going to impact their future profitability, because these are all for-profit companies as well. So that's where me being able to pull forward my capital markets experience, having listened to earnings calls, understanding how they communicate with Wall Street, frankly, with their stakeholders, and how does that intersect what we need to get done for a mission priority. So that's what I really enjoyed about it, was being able to look strategically at the total picture. We need to buy 10 ships over the next 15 years. Here's our contractors that can do the work. Where are they from a financial position? What incentivizes them? How can we structure something that's going to make them want to do business with us and be a good partner with us going forward? And so, my job title was a contracting officer, but what I really looked at myself was a strategic advisor to the program manager. So, you can buy something off of what's called GSA, the General Services Administration, I think.
Yeah.
You can buy something off the GSA.
Lauren, there's a lot of acronyms in your world, so you run with it. We won't notice. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like you always use the acronym, and then we have to think about what the words actually mean for the acronym. Sometimes it's a little tricky. But what we did on these major systems, what you would call the mega projects, are very different. You have to understand your contractor. You have to understand their financial situation. You have to understand what the end user needs, and try to blend that into something that makes sense from a business strategic standpoint. They have to want to do business with us. It has to be profitable. So a lot of times people think there's a war on profit, and that's probably, I'm not going to say that's wrong, but it's this mindset. And what I tried to do was recognize that they have to make a profit. They have stakeholders. We need products delivered. We have stakeholders. How do you actually make a relationship that's going to, support both of those initiatives?
Okay, that's really interesting, because for probably about 10 years, I worked in a large, big pharma development of factories, new product introductions. And the view I always took was that I love to see everyone making money. I want contractors making money. And the reason is, if contractors are making money, quality is usually better. If people are losing money, people cut corners. So it's really good to hear that in the federal government, that you recognize commercial businesses need to be profit orientated, and that's not a bad thing. I think it's actually the essence of commercial contracts. Is I'd much rather be dealing with companies who are making a profit from the work they engage in than companies who are losing money. I mean, there's a spiral, and it only goes one way if that is the case. So that's really good. Something else I want to ask you about, two things when I look at it from your contractor's perspective. And I'm sure there are plenty of people who are contractors in that space, and there are smaller organizations who would like to get into that space and get a slice of this big cake, perhaps. But in terms of how do you kind of get more credibility if you're a contractor in that space? So I'm not too sure if there's tiers and DCMA approvals, perhaps there is, but how do I go from being sort of a bronze to a platinum contractor, as the case may be? And it really comes back to, from my world, it's obviously being a trusted advisor, but the question is, how do you assess that trust from your contracting organizations?
Yeah, that's a great question. And GovCon is, it's kind of a buzzword that's kind of come out in the last 5 or so years, but it really defines anybody who's doing work in the federal government contracting space, whether you're a one-person shop up to, the $20 billion, major program, major contractors. And the way that you even get your foot in the door, everything about the US government is supposed to be publicized. So we're supposed to be putting out our budgets are published every year. If you know how to read them, it's like a whole other language. Sometimes feels like hieroglyphs, right? But the program planning starts 6 years before any money is ever really even appropriated. So there's a very long tail. And a lot of the ways that people get success in entering the market is by partnering. So joint ventures and M&A, mergers and acquisitions have been huge, again, in the past 5 to 10 years. And a lot of times companies will partner with either a medium size or a large business, either as a subcontractor or again, as a joint venture where they're both kind of awarded and they can run on their own ticket. And part of what the program manager, what we did and how DCMA and our administrative contracting officers support us is tracking cost, schedule, and performance. So how closely is the contractor managing to what they told us it was going to cost? Is it on schedule? And to your point, John, the quality, right? How well are they actually delivering the product and service that we ask them to deliver? And assuming those things go well, there's something called CPARS, which is the Contractor Performance Assessment Rating System, I think is what it's called. And CPARS is part of your past performance record. And so me as a contracting officer, when I was going to compete something, past performance was one of the things that I looked at. And so we would actually, it's a system that everybody within the government can look at and download and upload. And we would pull all the CPARS data and figure out, did this small business that was a new entrant, how did they actually do? And that actually is folded into the decision matrix for awarding to them or even going to them potentially sole source for the next requirement. So it is a long process. I will say part of it is luck. Part of it is strategy, and it's really knowing the market because as we've talked about, it is a very complicated system. It is a different language in a lot of ways. EVMS is one piece of a huge evaluation process. Many different policies and procedures are out there, and these small businesses trying to figure out how do they position themselves for success can be really challenging. They're like, I have a really good widget that I want to sell that I know is going to support the Marine Corps in a really material way, but they have to figure out the process and how do they get in front of the right people? How do they partner with the right team to really deliver that success? So it is not easy. It's a very long way of answering your question.
The strange analogy I'm thinking of as you're describing it, you're saying 6 years to sort of get ready. And it reminds me of an athlete getting ready for the Olympics, that they may be a secondary school student and, in 6 years' time, they'll be in the Olympics and they leave school and they spend their entire life preparing. So it seems it's like extremely onerous. And the problem with that, do I have to say, from a smaller business, there's a cost to that. So there must be barriers to entry. And obviously in that 6 years, there must be a whole range of checks and balances, audits, etc. And then I'm sure when you get the contract, there are complex audits as well. In terms of, while you're partnering with the private sector, which is absolutely the essence of GovCon and rightly so, in terms of the auditing or ensuring the quality how does that go about sort of being established and being measured then?
Yeah, so it kind of starts with, I'm a contracting officer, so I always go back to what's in the contract. Generally speaking, there's a whole attachment on the contract that talks about contract data requirements list or CDRLs. And those part of, if they had an EVMS program, that would be one of the CDRLs. If it has CSDR, that would be one of the CDRLs. There's monthly, bi-monthly cost reporting schedules. When we had one contract that was actually an award fee, meaning we paid their cost and then they had maybe a lower profit. But if they did really well and they met metrics of responsiveness, cost control, timeliness, they would actually, we would evaluate them and provide them an award fee that was higher than their base fee. So there's a lot of contractual mechanisms to track how they are performing against the requirements. And it is onerous, to your point. If you have 20 CDRLs and you're a small business and maybe you're a CEO and you're wearing the CFO, CEO, and the program lead hat, you have to figure out which bucket of this very standardized government form means that you have to send in this format, right? So we've tried to get away from that. We used to do mil specs or mil standards, which were very prescriptive. You shall deliver X in this, X number of inches by Y number of diameter. And I think it's about 15 or 20 years, we tried to pull back and do more of what they're called statement of objectives or statement of work or a performance work spec, to allow that flexibility, recognizing that commercial firms may have a better way of doing things than what we could envision. So there has been this transformation of trying to recognize that commercial firms are more agile than we are. And so there's still a blend, there's still that hard copy. You have to do your CDRL and you got to get it in the right format to the right people. But I think we're trying to get better about that and recognizing that metrics matter. Metrics are how we're going to be able to evaluate them for future awards, but not being so onerous such that it's a metric that doesn't matter, right? So when I was consulting with my program managers, I would say, how are you going to use this data? Okay, so you want them to report every 2 weeks on the number of folks they had starting Monday morning and ending Friday afternoon. How are you going to use that data? What does it do for you to make a strategic business decision to see that trend line? And if they could convince me that it was a trend line that would help them make business decisions for this procurement or for the next, then we would put that seed drill in. But there's a cost to that. So it's that balance. And that's where, being that strategic advisor is what I think the role is, because I'm the one that needs to help the program manager understand there's a cost to doing this. And if you get this data and you don't use it, why did you ask for it in the first place? So I think you can over metric something, and it's finding that sweet spot in what do you actually want to know about and how are you going to use that data.
Okay, but absolutely outstanding in that you're bringing private sector innovation into your GovCon model. So, I mean, even big multinationals like the Googles, the Intels, they're recognizing there is innovation, there is best practice happening in smaller organizations. So the fact you're sort of feeding off those and probably helping them fine tune them and make them better and share them with other contractors is really good. Two things that jumped out at me as you were explaining that. The first is, if you think about the complexity you talked about with the regular stuff, but in terms of cybersecurity, I mean, that is a runaway train. Meeting current standards in 6 years is probably out of date, in 12 months from now. In terms of the cybersecurity technology, how do you even begin to kind of manage that level of complexity again with how vast, and everything is digital now, and obviously with the military, and I mean, it's just a minefield. But that's my military term, by the way, in case you didn't. I'm learning.
No, it absolutely is. And, quagmire is also one that I've used regularly, which is not a military term. It's just kind of recognizing that cybersecurity is something that we are decades behind on, I will just say. The DoD, in general, we neophobic, right? So we recognize that there's a threat. We feel like if we control everything that we can possibly control and lock it down, then there can't ever be any risk. But the problem is exactly as you said, right? There are small businesses that want to get into the space. They want to perform. They want to support the warfighter. They want to support national security. But there's an executive order from 8 years ago that nothing really happened on, but all of a sudden they have to comply with it because now there's an interim rule out. So cybersecurity, runaway train, quagmire, whatever you want to call it, that's what keeps me up at night, quite frankly. I think cybersecurity is something that we have put a lot of words together, but this is a great example of the government folks writing a requirement and not understanding how industry is actually going to execute it. So it's, you need to do these. So there's a National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST 800-171, which you may or may not have seen. And that is not just for DoD, but here's the cybersecurity requirements that are necessary as a baseline protection for anybody who's doing business with the federal government. Great. NIST 800-171 has like 140 controls. Say you're that one shop guy who just wants to perform. And you're not a cybersecurity expert. How do you actually take those 140 controls in a meaningful way and protect national security and still deliver the requirement? So they have done a couple of, the Small Business Administration has recognized that there's a gap there for small businesses. They've kind of set up something called Project Spectrum, which is essentially like no-cost support for small businesses to try to figure out how to navigate these waters, which are complicated and change from day to day, frankly. So there are resources out there, but you have to know, you kind of even have to look for them. You may not even know that they're out there yet. So I think cybersecurity is the thing that keeps me up at night. And then when you kind of plug AI on top of that, it feels like there's, this wave that's building. And I'm not sure where it's going to crash over us, but solar winds, we've had a couple of hacks in the past couple of years. The solar winds is in with the Department of Justice right now. So I think there's a lot of things that are going to happen here very quickly that may open some eyes for folks about where do we need to be versus where we are in cybersecurity.
And again, the other thing, and you've sort of even given me more food for thought, is the complexity of supply chain. And supply chain is in in your case, is not just sort of manufacturing the product, it's getting that product to the war effort or wherever it may be going. So I'm even listening to you and I'm thinking that in many ways, when you look at sort of a small engineering company who hasn't got that cybersecurity, by actually assisting them to develop that capacity, you are in turn probably future-proofing your supply chain, because at the end of the day, if you're making an aircraft or a ship, in your case, it is engineering excellence you want, not perhaps cybersecurity excellence. You need that as well, but the core of the ship is engineering. So I suppose the next part of what I'd like to look at is, and again, each of these topics are a podcast episode in itself, but talk to me about the complexities of supply chain in GovCon military type contracts.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the projects I actually worked right after I started at the Pentagon was, it was called the Foreign Investment Tiger Team, or FIT. We called it, Tiger Team is one of those military terms where you put a whole bunch of people on something to try to come through a solution relatively quickly. And the idea was to try to get left of CFIUS, which is the Council on Foreign Investment in the US, which essentially looks at, is there investment that's coming into the US that might damage either our commercial pursuits or our national security. And I set that up to say, we quickly realized that CFIUS wasn't necessarily the problem. It's at the end of a very long tail, but the bigger issue was we didn't understand our supply chain. So I've talked a couple times about prime contractors. We hold them responsible for cost, schedule, and performance. We don't hold them responsible for understanding if their second, third, fourth, or fifth tier supplier is the only one that provides said widget, and they just got bought out by a Chinese conglomerate, right? And they're now no longer going to provide said widget, which is the only thing that makes the missile fly, right? So we have not been paying our prime contractors to manage the supply chain to that level. So yes, they know who they're buying from, the first tier, but they may not understand who's below that. And frankly, if you look at, there's a handful of these major prime contractors, and then there's the first tier subcontract, and then there's maybe a little bit below that. And then if you actually talk about who's providing those widgets, it comes back to a diamond shape. So, one supplier may be providing materials for all four services. And if they go out of business, or they decide that they want to retire because, they've supported for 30 years and they just want to retire, and they get bought out by a company that's not friendly to the US military, that's a real example of something that happened. We had to go back and redevelop something that we had been supplied for 30 years by one company, because they got bought out and that company no longer wanted to do business with the US government. So we are, frankly, decades behind on supply chain as well, and understanding the depth and the complexity from the primes all the way down back to that triangle, the diamond shape of the handful of folks that provide propellers for our ships, or widgets that make the missiles fly. So we actually there's an interim rule that actually just came out in the beginning of November that's trying to get after supply chain security. So it's probably going to take at least a year once that goes into contracts and people actually start having to manage to that requirement, before we understand, is it even meeting the need? Like, what problem is it trying to solve? And so that's kind of the disconnect of, the government is writing a requirement. They don't really understand how it actually impacts industry, and what industry has to do to comply with that. So we're really just at the tip of the iceberg of understanding the supply chain challenges, and trying to write contractual language to get after it. I think is it's to me, it's almost as big, if not bigger, than the challenge of cybersecurity.
Okay, and to me, listening to paradox is everything about government and military is they want certainty, but all the issues you sort of talk about, they indicate complexity. And that's the essence of what we define a complex project, is with a very high level of uncertainty. So you are an organization who loves certainty, but everything you deal with is complexity and uncertainty. So it's a strange paradox. Again, putting back on my kind of PPM hat here, in terms of managing this tsunami of work and stakeholders and money you're spending, how do enterprise PPM systems sit in that space, or how do they assist? Or is there standards? Is there a standard in enterprise PPM to actually be sort of recognized as a best of breed in government contracting?
So I will say, I don't think there's one that stands out that everybody uses. Government loves to provide requirements. I'd mentioned Seadrils before. Our large contractors probably already have systems that are either organic to themselves or they've bought to manage their own internal processes. So one of the things we tried to do again was, not write it so specifically to say you shall use this specific name brand system. It's you have to provide these 18 data points to us on a regular basis in a format that we can then upload. So I know I guess it was about 10 years ago, I think the best example from a government side, maybe not from industry side, we adopted an ERP system to do all of our financial management. So that was a huge change because when I first started, I literally had a hard copy, an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper that had what's called a line of accounting. And it's 16 or 18 characters, all of which mean something. And when I was doing my contract, I had to manually enter that 16 to 18 digits line of accounting. And then somebody, DCMA, when the contract was released and they got their copy, they would actually go in the back and they would pull that line of accounting and they would say, okay, I'm going to charge every 2 weeks against this line of accounting. Obviously, that was not going to withstand 300,000 contracts and $7 trillion forever. So they adopted this ERP system, which I know is used in other commercial systems as well. We only used it for finance, but that was kind of a test case of how well does the government adopt these big commercial systems and then try to tailor them for our needs. A perfect example is they didn't have billion-dollar line items, right? So an aircraft carrier is $10 billion.
Yes.
We had a challenge even putting in $1 billion of funding because the system didn't have that number of characters.
And really, it's your super complex issue came down to not being able to type zeros in an IT system, which sounds absurd to anyone listening. But okay, it's just a monster. One thing I am listening to you with my PPM hat, and I am thinking that if I was in that 6-year journey or I was that sort of lower level tier contractor and looking up, definitely what I would be doing is I would be sort of looking at my auditing requirements. I would be building it into my project pipeline. And when the auditor comes knocking on my door, the first thing I would be producing is a high level report from my enterprise PPM system to saying, this is our audit output. Now come and we'll validate anything on the report as such. So I do know there is work happening in enterprise PPM systems where they are looking to align with contractors and give a single source of truth in terms of DCMA reporting, etc. So we're stuck for time, Lauren. 2 questions I got to ask you before we finish. The first is around sustainability, ESG. It's a massive issue in government contracts here in Ireland and in Europe. In the US, is the whole ESG, sustainability, climate change, is that a big issue in GovCon at this moment?
So I think it was first adopted, frankly, if I go all the way back to my private finance days, companies that wanted to do ESG, that was something they had to report out to their shareholders because that was different. It's not something that we'd really paid attention to before. And, the industry, I think, is much more up to speed on ESG. The government side of the house is really just kind of starting. I think with the Biden administration, they put out some things about greenhouse gas and climate change. So it's starting to trickle into government contracting now, but it's certainly not, at least from my perspective, isn't fully baked. Again, it comes down to we believe that they want to do the right thing, right? We should be managing greenhouse gas and how does that impact our climate, but not necessarily understanding how that flows into contractual execution and what industry has to do in order to be compliant. As you said, if DCMA comes in and says, you said you were going to do these 5 things associated with climate change and reporting, you haven't done them. And their answer is, well, it wasn't clear who I was even supposed to report this to, right? So it is getting started, but similar to the supply chain, I think until we actually start executing against those requirements and figure out those gaps, we're not gonna be where we need to be against the administration's priorities.
Yes, and there is a cost to sustainability, and I think we got to be realistic about that. Commercial organizations are profit orientated, and we want them to be. So I do think that whole that sort of green agenda is really good from an aspirational point of view, but it does come down to hard dollars. We're really tight for time, Lauren, so I'm going to ask you one final question, and that is really, have you any final thoughts for our listeners who may be involved in government contracting or interested in DCMA type projects? Any final thoughts?
Yeah, I would say there, as you mentioned, probably every topic we mentioned could be its own podcast discussion. So it's knowing what you want to do. If you have a very niche thing that you know is going to be what the government is looking for, figure out who else is doing work in that space. Reach out, network, partner with them. There's a ton of huge conventions every year. Go there, just kind of get your face out there and kind of help contribute wherever you can. But it is very complicated, and it takes knowing the system, knowing the language to figure out where do you even inject. The 6-year timeline is a budget, right? So the government budgets 6 years in the past to figure out what they need in 2024. So if you know that you want to get in that, figure out how to read those budgets, subscribe. There's a bunch of people that'll do that data analytics for you. So figure out where do you want to spend your money from business development and marketing perspective, because there's a world out there. It's just, where do you want to actually provide the best service for your specific niche.
Okay, and I know in very recent times, Lauren, you have stepped into a consulting role. You have over 20 years experience in that space, and just listening to you, it is clear you have a lot of solutions to complex issues. And I'm a firm believer in it. The right person with the right knowledge can make perhaps a 1-month job, a day job. You pay for expertise, and I know you're in that consulting space. We're definitely going to speak again, but for now, Lauren, thank you so much for joining me on this space. People who want to get in contact with Lauren, you will find her on LinkedIn, and thank you very much, Lauren, for joining me.
It was my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening to the Project Management Paradise podcast at projectmanagementparadise.com.